this video lecture series for Introduction to Philosophy. In this video, we're going to continue our examination and discussion of cosmological arguments for the existence of God. In our previous video, we looked at the argument from causation from St. Thomas Aquinas, or what he calls his second way of demonstrating the existence of God. The basic idea there is that because he says the universe is not infinite, because nothing can cause itself, and because all material things have a cause, he thinks there must have been some, what he calls a first efficient cause that got this whole chain of events moving. Now, as we said, there are some criticisms you can make of how he argues to that first efficient cause. But to begin this video, what I want to begin with is a larger or more general theme. Again, I want to think about what is it that Aquinas is attempting to show is true. Now, you'll remember that all cosmological arguments attempt to show that there is some unique being that exists, a sort of being that is much different than anything we encounter in our normal day-to-day lives. And what Aquinas calls this first efficient cause, which he equates to God, that for him is that unique being. And what is unique about it? Well, if it's the very first efficient cause, then it must be something that is itself uncaused. It must be something that is eternal. It always existed. Nothing else brought it into existence. And if that's also the case, then it must be indestructible. It must be the sort of thing that cannot come into existence, cannot go out of existence, cannot be created nor destroyed. And again, if you compare that to the normal sorts of objects that you encounter in your day-to-day life, there's very good reason to think that if Aquinas has shown that such a being like that exists, he has certainly shown that something exists which is much different than what we normally encounter. So, but of course there's a further question here. Because let's say that Aquinas' reasoning is correct, that there is some being that is eternal, uncaused, and indestructible. We might ask, well, why do we need to think that is God? And in fact, I ended the last video with a discussion of this debate between Bertrand Russell and Frederick Copleston on just this question. When the debate between these two philosophers began looking at the cosmological argument, Bertrand Russell posed the idea that, well, let's suppose there is some being that is, a necessary being, as I said, that is uncaused, that's eternal. Why can't that just be the universe? In Russell's language, the way he put it, he says, the universe is all there is, and that's all there is to it. So, the question for the cosmological argument is always going to be the following. Granted, if we grant that we can show that there is some necessary being, an eternal, uncaused, and indestructible thing, why do we think that needs to be God? Why can't that just be the universe itself? In this video, we're going to look at one version of the cosmological argument which purports to show that the universe cannot be that necessary thing. And the universe cannot be that necessary being because the universe itself needed a cause. So let's take a look at this argument, and as you can see from the title of this video, the title of this argument is the Kalam Cosmological Argument, and it's been defended in a variety of forms by thinkers in many religious traditions, including Muslims, Jews, and every variety of Christian. But it was most recently defended in the 1970s, beginning in the 1970s and up to this day, by a philosopher named William Lane Craig, who we also discussed briefly in another video. So, Craig revives this argument, and he says, there's one form of the cosmological argument much neglected today, but of great historical importance, that aims precisely at the demonstration that the universe had a beginning in time. Now again, it's important to realize why it matters to say the universe had a beginning. If the universe had a beginning, then the universe must have been caused. If the universe was caused, then it can't be the necessary being. Because remember, the necessary being is uncaused, it's eternal, it's indestructible. So what this argument attempts to do is sort of thwart Bertrand Russell's claim that the universe is there and that's all there is to it. No, there is something outside of the universe. There's something that brought the universe into existence. There's something that explains the universe. So let's take a look at how the argument is outlined, and one of the appealing aspects of the Kalam Cosmological Argument, as Craig outlines, it's relatively simple. So P1, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. P2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, the universe has a cause of its existence. Now, the very first thing you'll notice here is that if you just look at the conclusion, the claim that the universe has a cause of its existence, that is still a long way from proving that cause is God. But I want to put those concerns to the side for a moment, because we're going to look at those in our next video. Because Craig thinks if he can get to this idea that there's a cause outside of the universe, he can show that that thing has to be a lot more godlike than we might suppose. But for the moment, put that aside. All we're going to be concerned about in this video is there a reason to think that the universe had a cause of its existence? Now again, notice why this is significant. If the universe began to exist, then that means there must be something that brought the universe into existence. And if it brought the universe into existence, then it must have existed prior to the universe in some sense. It must have, at minimum, be outside of the universe, external to the universe itself. And therefore, if that's true, it would be wrong of Russell to say the universe is just there and that's all. No, there's more to the story. Because now we have to wonder about what is that external cause that has brought the universe into existence. Okay, so the structure of the argument is relatively straightforward. I'm going to say a few things to begin about the first premise of the argument, but most of this video will focus on the second premise. Now, the first premise says, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence, and as you can see from the following passage, Craig doesn't think he needs to spend a lot of time defending this premise. He sees it as he says, relatively non-controversial, as just intuitively very appealing. Premise 1 strikes me as relatively non-controversial, Craig tells us. It is based on the metaphysical intuition that something cannot come out of nothing. With regard to the universe, if originally there was absolutely nothing, no God, no space, no time, then how could the universe possibly come to exist? So the basic idea is if you think of anything that comes into existence, that at one moment didn't exist and the next moment does, there must have been some cause of its existence. So you came into existence at some point, the cause of that was your parents. The car you drive came into existence at some point, the cause of that was the actions taken by the people constructing the car in the factory. So everything that doesn't always exist, everything that's not eternal, but comes into existence, must have had some cause. And the metaphysical intuition, the principle that he thinks explains why this is such an appealing idea, is this principle translated to, out of nothing comes nothing. For any existent entity X that began to exist, there must have been something which existed prior to X coming into being. So imagine that your parents never existed, you would never exist. Imagine that the factory and the parts for the car never existed, well then the car would never exist. And just sort of play that out. Imagine nothing existed, imagine there was a point in time when absolutely nothing existed. Well, if things can only come into existence if the parts that make them up were already in existence, then if nothing existed at some point, then nothing could ever exist. Out of nothing comes nothing. And this does seem to be a strongly intuitive claim, right? Because it's very hard for us to imagine something coming into existence out of absolutely nothing. Because where would the parts for that thing come from? Where would any of the components of that thing come from? So the first premise is this intuitive idea. Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. So let's say we accept that claim. We can accept that and say, okay, that's fine, but why do we need to think the universe began to exist? Because again, we considered the claim last time, and Russell brings us up that maybe the universe is eternal. It was just uncaused. It was always there. Okay, so Craig argues that the universe had to begin to exist. It had to have a beginning. And he provides two different justifications, two different arguments for this. On the one hand, he provides a scientific justification. As we're going to see, the standard Big Bang cosmology, that just means our standard understanding of the Big Bang and the origin of the universe, does hold that the universe began to exist, that the universe had a beginning. So on the one hand, he relies on a scientific justification to say that the universe must have come into existence. It must have had a beginning. In addition, he also provides a conceptual or philosophical justification. As we're going to see, Craig argues that there are various absurdities and just impossibilities that come about when we start really taking seriously this idea of an infinite universe. And because we can't have absurdities, because we can't have impossibilities, we should give up on the idea that the universe is infinite, that the universe always existed. Instead, we should say it had a beginning. Now, we're going to look at both of these justifications, but I'm not going to spend a ton of time in the scientific justifications, just because it's not really my area of expertise. But I'll say a few things about it just so you get the contours of the debate. So first, let's think about this idea of the Big Bang. So Craig argues that based on what we know about the Big Bang and the origin of the universe, that the universe must have had a beginning. And to a large extent, that will depend on how you conceive of the Big Bang or what you think is true about the Big Bang. And as I just mentioned, our standard view of the Big Bang does hold that the universe had a beginning. And one commentator explains it like this. The Big Bang theory claims that there was a mathematical point or singularity that did not exist in space-time. Now, this is the most difficult thing to wrap your mind around in terms of the Big Bang. I still have a very hard time with it myself, but it is critical for understanding many of the points we'll make later on. What the Big Bang says is that everything that existed, the universe itself was sort of contained at this one point prior to space and time. So it's not like, you don't want to say that at a certain time the universe existed as a certain point, or what's called a singularity. That's not quite right. The idea is that before the Big Bang occurred, and again, the word before is not even the one I should be using, but until the Big Bang occurred, there was no space and time. Space and time only came into existence when the universe came into existence. And so the Big Bang theory holds that this singular point, this singularity, existed prior to the universe and the space and time which it brought about. So the singularity had extreme properties such as infinite temperature and infinite density. And from this singularity, about 13.7 billion years ago, the universe as well as time and space exploded from it and spread out from a Big Bang. So to put it in very layman's terms, not sophisticated terms at all, the Big Bang theory holds that the universe started out as this tiny point of infinite temperature and density, exploded out 13.7 billion years ago, and here we are today. Now, if that's right, if that's the true conception, then it does seem that the universe had a beginning. And namely, the beginning was that time in which, for whatever reason, that singularity expanded out and created all the space and time that characterizes our universe now. And in fact, various religious figures celebrated the discovery of the Big Bang. So here was Pope Pius XII saying, "True science discovers God in an ever-increasing degree, as though God were waiting behind every door opened by science." So on the one hand, on the standard view of the Big Bang, you get a picture where the universe had a beginning, and then you can ask all the questions that Craig wants us to ask. Okay, well, if it had a beginning, it must have had a cause. If it had a cause, then there must have been something outside the universe itself. If there was something outside the universe itself, the universe doesn't explain itself, and now we have to wonder about what is this weird cause which exists outside the universe and outside of space and time. So Craig says, on the standard view, we get support for his second premise, that the universe had a beginning. Now, I will just mention that this is not the only conception of the Big Bang. There's actually a rival conception of the Big Bang called the Oscillating Universe theory. And another commentator explains the Oscillating Universe theory in the following way. The Oscillating Universe theory says, however, that there will be no heat death because the universe will stop its expansion before reaching that state. When the universe stops expanding, it will start contracting until it reaches the big crunch, the big crunch will eventually cause another big bang, and this alternation of expansion and contraction will continue. So what does the oscillating universe theory says? It essentially says that, well, what the Big Bang may have been the first event in which the universe started to expand, or it could have been the 1,000th or the 1,000,000th. Right, the oscillating universe theory says our universe sort of first expands out in a Big Bang. It gets to a certain size at which it stops moving outward, and it comes back onto itself in what's known as a big crunch, and it keeps doing this over and over and over again, expanding out, coming back together and crunching, expanding out, coming back together and crunching. Now, why does this matter? Well, if this is the case, then the Big Bang Theory doesn't necessarily show the universe had a beginning, because we can imagine this process going on for forever, for infinity. Like I said, for all we know, the expansion we're in right now could be the first expansion, it could be the third, it could be the 1,000th, the 1,000,000th, the 1,000,000th, the 1,000,000,000th, right? Any of those are possible as far as we know. But the point is that if that view of the Big Bang is true, then maybe the universe is just doing this eternal or infinite expansion and contraction, and there was no beginning. Maybe Aquinas was wrong. Maybe Craig is wrong. Maybe the universe is an infinite chain of events with infinite expansions and infinite contractions. Now, that's really all I want to say about the scientific justification for P2, and that's because, if I'm honest with you, I really don't know which of these conceptions of the Big Bang is true. That's really a question for a physicist. If you look online on YouTube, you can see a number of videos of Craig himself responding to questions and actually rejecting the oscillating universe theory. So I'll leave that question to those who are a little better equipped to deal with the science and physics and cosmology of the universe. And the other reason I'm not going to spend too much more time on that is because Craig also provides a philosophical justification for P2. So he says, although Craig thinks our best science does support the idea that the universe began to exist, he says we can also know this conceptually or philosophically. And to demonstrate this, he uses this famous example, which is called Hilbert's Hotel. And so what I want you to do right now is pause this video. I want you to go to the description. I want you to pull up the PDF document that I'm using in this video right now. And I want you to click on this link here. Because to understand Hilbert's Hotel, I think it's best if you see it visually. And the video in that link does a pretty good job. You can watch the whole thing. It's about 6 minutes. But if you just watch the first 2 minutes and 15 seconds, you will get the gist of Hilbert's Hotel. So go ahead and pause this video and watch that video and then come back when you have done that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this example with Hilbert's Hotel. It's a strange example to wrap your mind around, and of course that's sort of the point. Now, what we have here is this infinite hotel that is filled up with infinite people. That itself is of course hard enough to imagine, but where the paradox and the difficulty really begins is when we imagine the night manager of the hotel being faced with the task of accommodating additional passengers, of accommodating additional guests. Now, at first you might say, well, that's impossible, because if, in fact, this is an infinite hotel with infinite rooms and infinite people, then the hotel should be occupied and no one else should be able to be accommodated in the hotel. But of course, we have to take seriously what it means for a hotel to be infinite. If a hotel is infinite, then that means there's always more room. There's always an additional room. And this, I think it brings it home, really, it puts a fine point on it. When we think about the idea that in Hilbert's Hotel, as the video explains, you can accommodate an infinite amount of additional guests. So if an infinite bus with infinite passengers pulls up to the hotel, all the night manager needs to do is tell everybody in every single room to go to room number 2n. That means their room number times 2. So the person in room 1 goes to room 2. The person in room 5 goes to room 10. Person in room 1001 goes to room 2002. The important point about this is that this means every single guest will end up in an even number room, which means all the odd number rooms are vacant. And because there's an infinite number of odd numbers, now an infinite number of guests can be accommodated. And of course, it's quite comical when at the end of the video there, at around the 2:15 mark, the individual doing the explanation says, well, now the night manager is banking more money than ever with infinite guests, but of course actually just banking the same amount of money as before because, well, what is infinity plus infinity? Well, just infinity. The idea behind Hilbert's hotel is that it's supposed to show us there are real difficulties with infinity, and specifically when we start thinking about things like hotels, like material objects or bounded finite objects as being infinite. So the first paradox to keep in mind is that Hilbert's hotel, one problem with it, it seems both completely occupied and also vacant. Right? It's completely occupied because there's infinite rooms with infinite people. It's also vacant because there's infinite rooms, there's always an additional room. There's always a way to, in fact, accommodate more guests. And the paradoxes don't stop there. Another way we can see a problem with infinity is I want you to imagine what I'm calling the even set and the odd set. So the even set is just the set of every even numbered room in Hilbert's hotel. So room 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, etc., etc. The odd set is the set of all the odd numbered rooms. So room 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, etc. So we have these two sets of rooms. Now, because there's an infinite number of even numbers and an infinite number of odd numbers, both sets will contain an infinite number of rooms. They're two infinite sets. Now, what's strange here is what happens when you begin adding these sets together. So let's say, for instance, you take the even set, all the even rooms, and you add on top of that all the odd rooms. Well, what are you left with? Well, we just said that infinity plus infinity is equal to infinity. So when you take the odd set and you add it on top of the even set, you're left with what is equivalent to the even set. You're left with no more than you had before, even though you just added an infinite number of new rooms to what you began with. And that seems very strange. And the same thing can go in the opposite direction. If you say, well, here's the odd set of rooms, let me add this whole even set of rooms to it, you end up with what is equivalent to the odd set, because again, infinity plus infinity is just equal to infinity. But if the process of addition doesn't add anything new over top of what we started, then that's just absolutely absurd. How could it be that you can add something to what you began with and not end up with anything more than what you began with? So there are a number of strange absurdities and impossibilities that occur when we start thinking about infinity as instantiated in something actual. And Craig himself explains a few other of these. He says, suppose some of the guests start to check out. Suppose the guest in room 1 departs. Is there now one less person in the hotel? Not according to the mathematicians, but just ask the woman who makes the beds. Suppose the guests in room numbers 1, 3, 5, etc., etc., all the odd numbered rooms check out. In this case, an infinite number of people have left the hotel. But according to the mathematicians, there are no less people in the hotel, but don't talk to the laundry woman. So the same thing goes for addition that goes for subtraction. You can take out an infinite number of rooms, namely all the odd numbered rooms, or even numbered rooms from Hilbert's hotel, and be left with the exact same amount that you started with. So all these absurdities, the idea that the hotel is both vacant and full, the idea that you can add and subtract and be left with the same thing you had before, Craig thinks that this shows something fundamental and conceptual about the impossibility of infinity. He tells us, if we're to avoid these absurdities, then we must deny that an actually infinite number of things exists. And the phrase for him, actually infinite, is important. Perhaps it's possible for infinity to exist in some hypothetical or theoretical way, but it can't be an actual thing that exists in the world. Actual things that exist in the world cannot be infinite. They must, be finite and have limits, or else we run into all these absurdities. Okay, now you might say, well, what does this have to do with the original argument about the universe? Why we're talking about hotels, but how does this help Craig prove the claim that the universe began to exist? Well, it does so in the following way, because he's showing that you can't have an infinite number of actual things. So now let's not talk about hotels and rooms in a hypothetical hotel. Let's talk about moments of time in an infinite universe. So you're imagining that the universe always existed, and it's eternal in some sense, which means there's an infinite number of moments in time. So that means, for instance, if you started at the moment we're at right now, the present, and started counting backwards, you would never get to an endpoint, or in this case, the beginning of the universe. And not just because you would get tired of counting or you would die before you could do it, finish the task, but because there is no beginning. So we're imagining a universe with infinite number of moments of time. And notice we can run the same infinity addition paradox. First, let's take the even set. So as you're counting backwards in time, all the moments in time which have an even number, right? So the second moment, the fourth moment, the sixth, the eighth, etc. All of those are in the even set. Likewise, the odd set is comprised of all the odd numbered past moments. So the first moment, the third, the fifth, the seventh, the ninth, etc., etc. And if you think about moments in time, it seems that they're analogous to rooms in the hotel in certain ways, right? Moments of time can be occupied by things, events happen in them. And also we can add them together and, subtract them. So let's say you take the even set, all the even numbered moments of time, add the odd numbered moments of time, you're left again with no more than you started with. You're left with just the even set, or what's equivalent to it. And the same the other direction. If you start out, okay, here are all the odd numbered moments of time. Let's add all the even numbered moments in time, an infinite amount of moments, and again, you're left with nothing more than what you started. But once again, this seems fundamentally absurd. If you can't have a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, if that's absurd and impossible, then why can you have a universe with an infinite amount of moments in time? Why is that any less absurd? Why is that any less impossible? And in fact, Craig says it's not. He says for the same reason that we should think that Hilbert's hotel is just a hypothetical thing we can imagine, but not something that could actually exist, so an infinite universe is something that hypothetically we can imagine, but could not actually exist because of all the paradoxes, impossibilities, and absurdities which it would ultimately create. So this gives him his philosophical justification for P2. If the universe is not infinite, it must have began to exist. And because, as he says in P1, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence, that means the universe has a cause of its existence. Now, as I said before, if you buy that reasoning, then we're still not all the way to God. We have some further questions to ask. But now we're moving in a direction of that unique being, because now we're saying, okay, there's something outside the universe, outside space and time, outside the normal physical reality we encounter every day. And so we might start to wonder, well, if Craig is right that the universe has a cause of its existence, what sort of properties does that thing have? Now that question we will save till our next video, so I'll cut it here. I hope you found this video useful, and I will see you next time.